Hawk News 2, insert tagline here. A woman has just been arrested for cutting off her husband's... Does that say penis?
Yes, it does, Ava. I'm here in the field with police officers as they search for the offending appendage. Officials say it was tossed out of a car window near here just a few short hours ago. It is now a race against time to see if it can be found and successfully reattached.
Officer Perry. Yes, sir. Found it.
A man innocently sleeping, a woman allegedly abused. What's the real story? Join me for an interview with the woman behind it all, Lorena Bobbitt.
I was being assaulted every night. Doesn't that matter? All anyone wants to talk about is his penis. Like, they don't care why I did what I did.
Was this premeditated then?
No, I'm not some crazy, jealous lady. I was in a daze. He raped me and then drunkenly blacked out. I snapped. This had to be the last time.
So I guess the big question here is, why'd you throw the penis out the car window?
Well, I tried driving the car, obviously, but I had this thing in my hand, and so I couldn't. So I got rid of it.
We'll be keeping up with live coverage of the case as it progresses. Battered women syndrome is a term that's been tossed around a lot lately, but what exactly is it? Let's join Ariana on the street asking people, what do they think about battered women syndrome?
Battered women syndrome is a subcategory of PTSD that describes a pattern of behavior that develops in victims of domestic violence as a result of long-term abuse. Battered women syndrome begins as a three-stage cycle of abuse. First, the abuser exhibits behaviors that create tension in the relationship, such as drinking. Next, the abuser blows up and commits some form of abuse, whether that be physical, psychological, emotional, sexual, or otherwise. Finally, the abuser tries to fix his wrongdoing and apologizes. This third phase is often referred to as the honeymoon stage, where the abuser makes amends for his bad behavior and is forgiven before the cycle repeats again. As this cycle continues, the victim starts to blame herself for the abuse and takes responsibility for it, which develops into learned helplessness.
Next, we'll be interviewing people on the street. How do you feel about
Oh my god, I love these. I'm listening to Cannibal by Kesha.
how do you feel about the Lorena Bobbitt case?
Oh, Lorena! Yeah, she slayed. Honestly, if I was her, I wouldn't have even told them where it was.
So how do you feel about battered women syndrome?
Oh, yeah, that.
They can still hear you. Well, anyways, women suffering from battered women syndrome take full responsibility for their abuse. They fear for their safety, and they have an irrational belief that their abuser is all-powerful and will hurt or kill them if they seek help.
In that case, I fully support it. Not only do I support women's rights, but I support their wrongs too.
Moving on.
Why didn't she just leave earlier? I wouldn't have put up with it if he was actually abusing me.
Learned helplessness convinces a victim that she cannot escape abuse without taking drastic measures.
Learned helplessness? It just sounds like she's looking for attention to me.
Battered women syndrome can lead to learned helplessness, where a woman feels so defeated, depressed, and compliant that she believes she is incapable of leaving her abuser. Because of this, women are much less likely to leave an abusive situation.
Still, she did the worst thing you can do to a man. She took away his manhood.
I'm sorry. She did the worst thing you can do to a man? He did the worst thing you could do to a woman. It was an act of retaliation, of self-defense. He deserved it, and she did what was right in my book. Lorena Bobbitt is innocent.
Using battered woman syndrome as a defense focuses on the response to intimate partner violence. In self-defense claims, the defendant would be required to prove four things: that they were confronted with an unprovoked attack, that there was the threat of injury or death, that the degree of force used was objectively reasonable, and that they had a reasonable fear of being killed or injured. In most of the battered woman cases, the defendant cannot prove all four requirements. Imperfect self-defense has been introduced by expert testimony to demonstrate the defendant's fear of intimate harm. Imperfect self-defense is a partial affirmative defense, meaning that the defense limits the defendant's liability. The defendant will admit guilty but seek a less severe punishment. For example, in the case People versus Humphrey, the woman was charged with killing a man who she was living with. The jury found her guilty of voluntarily manslaughter. However, when the case reached the Supreme Court, they reversed the judgment because of the lack of consideration for evidence of battered woman syndrome. They had expert and non-expert testimonies of the defendant living with an abusive man and her experiencing symptoms of battered woman syndrome. Some have also raised battered woman syndrome as a part of the duress defense. However, not all courts have accepted battered woman syndrome as an explanation for it. To demonstrate duress, the defendant must prove a reasonable belief that her partner intended to hurt her and her behavior was necessary to avoid such harm. Because of the lack of research for battered woman syndrome, some people think that using PTSD as an explanation might prove a more reliable method for understanding a defendant's response to intimate partner violence.
If you or a loved one are involved in an abusive relationship, please call the National Domestic Violence Hotline. This has been Hawk News 2.